What's up, everyone? So, before we explore this really important topic, I just want to share really some essential educational disclaimers. This video provides educational information about spiritual bypassing, trauma based on scientific research that really is intended for informational purposes only, and the content is not to diagnose, to treat, to cure, to prevent any medical or psychological condition. So, nor is it to be used as a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So if you are experiencing those symptoms of trauma and depression and anxiety or any other mental health concerns, please seek guidance from a qualified mental health professional or healthcare provider, a licensed therapist, a medical doctor, or just some of those examples. Always consult with your provider before making any changes to your current treatment plan. So while this video will discuss various research findings and approaches, no claims are made about specific treatment outcomes. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly, and what research really observes and studies just may not apply to everyone. So this information should not be used to replace professional medical or psychological care. That being said, I am Tanya Octave. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and wellness coach. However, this video does not constitute a therapeutic relationship or a professional consultation. For professional guidance, please schedule a formal consultation with a professional and qualified individual. So, that being said, let's get started. In my reflection today, I was thinking, I want to start today with something that happened to me several years ago that really completely changed how I understood the relationship between spirituality and emotional healing. I was going through a particular challenging period in life, dealing with some deep family patterns and these unresolved grief issues. Instead of sitting with these difficult emotions, I kind of felt myself at that time really diving deeper and deeper into spiritual practices, meditation retreats, even a positive workshop and reframing thoughts, going to those here and there. And so on the surface, this looked like there was some really healthy spiritual growth going on. I was meditating daily, I was reading spiritual texts, attending these workshops, and constantly affirming things like, everything happens for a reason. This is for my growth, right? That's what I told myself. I'm exactly where I need to be. But underneath this spiritual activity, I was actually avoiding this very real, very painful part of trauma that needed and often was calling my attention. I was using spirituality as a way to bypass these difficult, or I guess I'll say the difficult emotional work that was calling me. It wasn't until, let's say, a wise mentor pointed out something that I was spiritually bypassing. That's when I realized what was happening. This term was first coined by psychologist John Welwood in 1984 and describes the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to really sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business to shore up a shaky sense of self. What I thought was spiritual growth was actually a sophisticated form of avoidance. That was keeping me stuck in these patterns and that really just kind of needed some healing. And so this experience led me to even dive deeper into research on spiritual bypassing trauma. And what I discovered was both eye-opening and concerning. According to research from leading experts like Dr. Craig Cashwell and even Dr. Jesse Fox, and then there's Robert Augustus Masters, really kind of looked at how spiritual bypassing is not only common, but that it can actually create its own form of trauma when spiritual practices are used in a way to avoid rather than to integrate these difficult emotions and difficult experiences. So today, we are going to explore what research tells us about spiritual bypassing trauma. We're going to look at and examine the scientific evidence on how this phenomena affects things like our body, our mind, even our spirit, and understand how this form of trauma develops and manifests in people's lives. This is educational content really designed to increase awareness of documented research findings and not to provide, let's say, a specific treatment recommendation. So let me share what research has discovered about spiritual bypassing and how it can create its own form of trauma. I'll start with what Dr. Craig Cashwell from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro has really conducted some of the most comprehensive research in the field. And his findings reveal these important insights about how spiritual practices can sometimes, harm rather than heal. There was his groundbreaking 2007 study entitled "The Only Way Out is Through the Peril of Spiritual Bypass," which has been cited in over 154 other research studies. Dr. Cashwell found that spiritual bypassing occurs when people use spiritual experiences and beliefs or practices to avoid psychological wounds and other personal and emotional unfinished business. What makes this particularly concerning is that it often happens unconsciously, with people genuinely believing that they are engaging in these healthy spiritual practices. Dr. Cashwell's research reveals some striking statistics about spirituality in America, and it really helps us understand, let's say, the scope of the issue. His studies show that 96% of individuals in the U.S. had some belief in God, and more than 90% prayed. About 69% were church members, about 43% had at least attended church. But with such a widespread engagement in spiritual practices, the potential for spiritual bypassing really affecting millions and millions of people. The research shows that spiritual bypassing trauma develops when there's let's say, a split between spiritual ideas and fundamental psychological needs. Then there's Robert Augustus Masters, a psychotherapist and a spiritual teacher who wrote the first really comprehensive book on the topic, and explains that spiritual bypassing is really so pervasive that it goes so largely unnoticed. In his 2010 book, Spiritual Bypassing, When Spirituality Disconnects Us from What Really Matters, which has, been cited in over 218 research studies, Masters describes how spiritual ideas of any tradition can provide easy justification for practitioners to just duck uncomfortable feelings in favor of more seemingly enlightened activity. What's particularly important to understand from the research is that spiritual bypassing trauma isn't caused by spirituality itself, but by the misuse of spiritual practices to avoid emotional integration. Then Dr. Jesse Fox and his colleagues developed the Spiritual Bypassing Scale 13, really is a validated psychological assessment tool that measures spiritual bypassing tendencies. Their research published in 2017 and cited in about 104 studies showed and found that spiritual bypassing involves these specific patterns, including compulsive kindness, things like repressed of unwanted emotions, even spiritual narcissism, and also this idea of emotional disassociation. The cross-cultural research conducted by Alejandra Montino and her team, published in Frontiers in Psychology in 2021, really provides fascinating insights into how cultural context influences spiritual bypassing patterns. Their study of about, I think it was 435 people from Honduras and Spain, found that spiritual bypassing can function as either a helpful or a harmful coping strategy, really depending on the social and cultural context. So in Honduras, where about 90% of the population considers the religion to be very important, spiritual bypassing was more common, but also more socially supported. So that's an important kind of idea to keep in mind. In Spain, where there was only about 22% considered religion to be that as important, spiritual bypassing was less common, but more potentially leading to issues of isolation when it occurred. So the research suggests that spiritual bypassing trauma might develop when there's this mismatch between an individual's spiritual coping strategies and their actual emotional needs. And when spiritual practices are used to, let's say, avoid rather than integrate these difficult experiences. The trauma aspect comes from internal conflict between the authentic self that needs to process emotions and the spiritual persona that believes such emotions are unspiritual or unenlightened. Research has identified several specific patterns that characterize spiritual bypassing, and understanding these patterns can really help us recognize when spiritual practices might be creating rather than resolving trauma. John Welwood, who originally coined the term in around 1984, described spiritual bypassing as using spiritual ideas and practices to really sidestep personal, emotional, and unfinished business. His work, particularly in his book, 2002 book, Toward a Psychology of Awakening, which is cited in about 911 research studies, provides a framework for understanding how the phenomena develops. So, according to Welwood's research, spiritual bypass often involves what he calls premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we've actually integrated those experiences. This creates a split between our spiritual aspirations and our human reality, which can be deeply traumatizing to the psyche. So Dr. Cashwell's research identifies several specific manifestations of spiritual bypassing that can create trauma responses. These include using spiritual practices to avoid things like grief, anger, fear, or believing that you have negative emotions means that you're not spiritual enough. Using spiritual concepts like everything happens for a reason to avoid responsibility for healing, and really engaging in compulsive spiritual practices as a way to manage anxiety or depression rather than addressing, let's say, these underlying causes. So Robert Augustus Masters' comprehensive research describes spiritual bypassing is involving several key characteristics that can become traumatic patterns. These include excessive detachment from emotions, spiritual narcissism, where people believe that they are evolved more than others, compulsive positivity that denies the reality of suffering, and using spiritual practices to maintain, let's say, a false sense of control over life circumstances. The research shows that spiritual bypassing trauma often develops in this gradual way as people unconsciously learn to use spiritual concepts and practices to really avoid emotional discomfort. Over time, this creates this internal split where the person's authentic emotional experience becomes increasingly disconnected from their spiritual identity. And it is this disconnection that can be deeply traumatizing because it involves a fundamental rejection of the core aspects of the human experience. So, Dr. Fox's research using the spiritual bypassing scale 13 has identified these specific factors that can predict spiritual bypassing tendencies. These include high levels of spirituality combined with low emotional awareness, tendencies towards perfectionism, difficulty tolerating uncertainty, and a history of trauma that hasn't been adequately processed. The research suggests that people who have experienced trauma may be particularly vulnerable to spiritual bypassing because spiritual practices can prove a sense of control and meaning that feels safer than directly confronting traumatic experiences. So what makes spiritual bypassing particularly insidious? According to the research, it is often masquerade as spiritual growth. People engaging in spiritual bypassing may appear to be highly spiritual, dedicated practitioners who are committed to their spiritual growth and development. However, underneath this spiritual presentation, they may be avoiding fundamental aspects of their human experience that need attention and integration. And in the cross-cultural research reveals that spiritual bypassing patterns can vary significantly based on the cultural context. So in cultures where spirituality is highly valued and socially supported, spiritual bypassing may be more normalized and therefore is less likely to be recognized as problematic. And then in other cultures where spirituality is less central, spiritual bypassing may be more isolating and therefore more likely to create trauma responses in individuals. So let me share an educational case study that really illustrates how spiritual bypassing can develop and manifest in someone's life. I'm going to call this person Sarah. And this is a composite example created for educational purposes to really protect confidentiality, but also demonstrates how these concepts that we're discussing right now. So let me introduce Sarah. Sarah grew up in a family where, let's say, emotions were rarely discussed and spiritual practices were highly valued. From a young age, she learned to be spiritual. And what that meant was peaceful, positive, really kind of detached from these worldly concerns. And so when difficult emotions arose, she was taught to pray them away, to meditate until they passed. And this real early conditioning set the stage for what would later become a pattern of spiritual bypassing. And in her 20s, Sarah experienced a series of significant losses: the loss of the death of a parent, the end of a long-term relationship, and job instability. Instead of allowing herself to really grieve these losses fully and completely, she threw herself into spiritual practices. So she attended meditation retreats, studied spiritual texts intensely, and surrounded herself with spiritual communities that focused and emphasized transcending suffering rather than processing it. And on the surface, Sarah appeared to be handling her challenges with remarkable grace and spiritual maturity. She spoke eloquently about acceptance and surrender and the lessons her challenges were teaching her about life and about herself. However, underneath the spiritual presentation, she was experiencing increasing anxiety, depression, and a sense of disconnection from herself and others. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her spiritual practices had become a sophisticated form of avoidance. Every time grief, anger, or fear arose, she immediately shifted into spiritual mode, meditating, affirming, or speaking spiritual explanations for her pain. While these practices provided temporary relief, They prevented her from actually processing and integrating her emotional experiences. The trauma aspects of Sarah's spiritual bypassing became apparent when she began experiencing what she termed and described as a spiritual emergency, periods of intense anxiety and depression that seemed to come out of and from nowhere. During these episodes, her usual spiritual practices not only failed to help her, but actually seemed to make things worse for her. She felt like a spiritual failure, which added to shame and self-judgment to her already difficult emotional state. Sarah's turning point came when she encountered a therapist who understood spiritual bypassing and could help her to recognize these patterns. And it was through this work she began to understand that her spiritual practices, while valuable, had been used as a way to avoid rather than integrate her human experiences. She learned that true spiritual growth required embracing rather than transcending her emotional reality. The research suggests that Sarah's experience is not uncommon. Many people who engage in spiritual bypassing really report these similar patterns of apparent spiritual growth accompanied by these underlying emotional distressing moments. The trauma occurs not from the spiritual practices themselves, but from the internal split created when spirituality is used to reject rather than integrate human experience. What's particularly important to understand from cases like Sarah is that bypassing spiritual trauma often goes unrecognized because it's hidden behind what appears to be a healthy spiritual practice. People experiencing this form of trauma may be reluctant to seek help because they fear it means that they're not spiritual enough or that they're failing in their spiritual development. The research emphasizes that recovery from spiritual bypassing trauma requires a different psychological perspective and really developing an emotional awareness and tolerance and finding ways to both honor spiritual aspirations and human reality without creating this internal split between them. Research suggests that addressing spiritual bypassing trauma requires this comprehensive approach that honors both spiritual and psychological dimensions of the human experience. So while individual needs may vary, studies have examined various components that might be helpful when working with qualified professionals who really understand this specialized area. Dr. Cashwell's research emphasizes the importance of what he calls integrated approaches that combine spiritual awareness with psychological insight. His study suggests that effective work with spiritual bypassing trauma involves really helping people with what he terms spiritual emotional intelligence, the ability to use spiritual practices to enhance rather than avoid emotional awareness or processing. The research indicates that addressing spiritual bypassing trauma really requires or often requires developing greater tolerance for emotional discomfort and uncertainty. Studies suggest that people who engage in spiritual bypassing often have difficulty sitting with emotions, preferring to transcend or transform them quickly through this spiritual practice, versus like listening to be present with emotions without immediately trying to change them appears to be an important component of the recovery. And so it's about maybe slowing down and staying connected versus immediately trying to avoid. Robert Augustus Masters research suggests that Healing spiritual bypassing trauma involves what he calls conscious relationship, both spiritual and psychological aspects of experience. His work indicates that this might involve learning to distinguish between the healthy spiritual practice that enhances emotional awareness and spiritual bypassing that really avoids this emotional reality. Research on mindfulness-based approaches suggests that certain forms of meditation and contemplative practices really can be helpful for spiritual bypassing trauma when it emphasizes present moment awareness rather than transcendence or escape. Studies indicate that practices that encourage curiosity about and acceptance of emotional experience might be particularly beneficial. But cross-cultural research suggests that addressing spiritual bypassing trauma must take into account cultural and social contexts. In cultures where spirituality is highly valued, it might be important to find ways to maintain spiritual connections while developing a greater emotional integration. And then in cultures where spirituality is less central, it might be important to address the isolation can result from spiritual bypassing patterns. Research on body-based approaches suggests that spiritual bypassing trauma often involves the disconnection from the physical and emotional sensations. Studies even indicate that practices that help people reconnect to their bodies and develop a greater somatic awareness might be helpful in the components of a comprehensive approach. So it is crucial to emphasize that these research findings describe general patterns observed in studies, not treatment recommendations for specific individuals. So any exploration of these approaches should be undertaken with a qualified healthcare professional who really can provide you these personal guidance based on individual circumstances and really your needs at the time. Research suggests that spiritual bypassing trauma can have far-reaching effects that extend beyond the individual experiencing it. Studies indicate that when people use spiritual practices to avoid emotional processing, it can affect their relationship, their spiritual communities, and even the children and family members in their environment. The research shows that spiritual bypassing can create what some research calls spiritual codependency in relationships. And that's where partners or family members enable each other's avoidance or difficult emotions through shared spiritual practices and beliefs. This can create family systems where emotional authenticity is discouraged in favor of spiritual performance. Something to consider. Studies suggest that children who grow up in families where spiritual bypassing is common may learn to disconnect from their own emotional experience even at an early age. Research indicates that these children might be at higher risk for developing their own patterns of emotional avoidance and may struggle with emotional regulation and, let's say, authentic self-expression. The research also suggests that spiritual bypassing can affect spiritual communities and organizations. Studies indicate that communities where spiritual bypassing is normalized may inadvertently create environments where emotional authenticity is discouraged and where people feel pressure to maintain a spiritual persona rather than being genuine about their struggles and their challenges. However, research also suggests that when people address their own spiritual bypassing patterns, it can really have a positive ripple effect. Studies indicate that individuals who learn to integrate spiritual and emotional awareness often become more emotionally available in their relationships and more authentic even in their spiritual communities. So, some research does suggest that addressing spiritual bypassing trauma can lead to what researchers call spiritual maturity or mature spirituality, a form of spiritual practice that enhances rather than diminishes emotional awareness and human connection. Studies indicate that people who have developed this integrative approach often report greater life satisfaction and just more meaningful relationships. So, if you recognize patterns in this educational content that seem relevant to like your own experience, it's important to know that professional support is available from various practitioners who understand this concept of spiritual bypassing trauma. Research consistently shows that working with qualified professionals who are trained in both spiritual and psychological approaches can be helpful for people exploring these patterns. The research suggests that the first step in addressing spiritual bypassing trauma is often in developing an awareness of this pattern. Many people report that simply understanding the concept of spiritual bypassing helps them recognize when they might be using spiritual practices to, let's say, avoid rather than integrate their emotional experience. Studies indicate that addressing spiritual bypassing trauma often involves learning to develop what researchers call emotional courage, the willingness to feel difficult emotions without immediately trying to transcend or transform them through spiritual practices. This doesn't mean abandoning spiritual practice, but rather learning to use spiritual practices in ways that will enhance rather than diminish emotional awareness. The research emphasizes that healing spiritual bypassing trauma is not about rejecting spirituality, but about developing a more mature and integrated relationship with spiritual practice. Studies suggest that people who successfully address spiritual bypassing often report that their spiritual practice becomes deeper and more meaningful when it is grounded in emotional authenticity rather than avoidance. Research indicates that this type of healing often requires patience and compassion, both in oneself and for the process. Studies suggest that people who have been using spiritual practices to avoid emotions may initially experience an increase in emotional intensity as they begin to allow previously avoided feelings to surface. So, if you're interested in learning more about whether professional support might be helpful for exploring these patterns, I offer a free 15-minute educational consultation where we can maybe discuss some of your specific patterns and interests and explore whether therapeutic approaches might be, let's say, appropriate for you. As a licensed psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and a wellness coach, I work with people who are interested in developing these integrative approaches in spiritual and emotional well-being. However, this video does not establish a therapeutic relationship, and an individual consultation is necessary for, let's say, more personalized guidance. Before we close, I want to share with you really some important mental health resources. So if you are experiencing thoughts of self-harm, please contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 988, or simply text HOME to 741-741 for the crisis text line. For general mental health support, the national hotline is 1-800-662-4357, and it's available 24 hours, 7 days a week for referrals. For those interested in learning more about spiritual bypassing trauma, reputable resources includes the works from John Welwood, Robert Augustus Masters, even Dr. Craig Cashwell. Peer-reviewed research can be found in databases like PubMed and professional organizations like the International Association for the Study of Spirituality, and they offer additional educational resources as well. So remember, this video is for educational purposes only, and it does not constitute medical, psychological, therapeutic advice. The research findings discussed represent general patterns observed in studies, not predictions for individual experiences. Individual experiences, they just vary so greatly, and professional consultation is recommended for anyone interested in exploring these patterns and dealing with trauma symptoms. The approaches and concepts discussed should only be explored, let's say, with qualified professionals that can really provide these really personalized guidance based on your specific situation and needs. Thank you for joining me for this educational exploration on spiritual bypassing trauma research. If this information was helpful, please consider subscribing for more educational content about trauma research, spiritual integration, even mental health awareness. Take care of yourself, and remember that seeking professional support is a sign of strength and self-care. This video is part of an educational series on 5 types of spiritual trauma that psychology doesn't recognize. The original video is in the link below. Each video in this series really explores different aspects of spiritual trauma to begin expanding and increasing our awareness and understanding about these how important and often unlooked, overlooked, not thought about or discussed phenomena it really is. Thank you very much for listening, and very much thank you for all the support.